Welcome to another of our podcasts recorded at the Rockwell Foundation, Berlin, where I am talking to some of the economists who are creating the next edition of the Handbook of Labor Economics. My name is Tim Phillips. Policymakers worry about the effects on our wallets of monopoly, where there is one dominant supplier who controls the prices of things we want to buy. But we don't hear nearly as much about another potential abuse of economic power called monopsony that could be making millions of working people poorer. Well, could that now be changing? I spoke to Patrick Kline from UC Berkeley about the potential problem of monopsony and, first of all, the difference between monopsony and monopoly.
Monopsony is really about the attachment of workers to firms and what their outside options are. So in the usual textbook models that economists have traditionally focused on, the idea, which sounds kind of absurd, is that if the firm were to cut wages even 10 cents below the so-called market price, that's the price that the invisible hand determines through people switching employers and so on, supply equaling demand, that everybody would leave. Whereas if they paid even a cent above the market wage, there would just be a glut of workers showing up at the door demanding jobs. The usual idea is that there's this very strong disciplining force that makes the firm almost helpless. It has to take the market price as given, and it just really has no control over what wages it sets, which is kind of absurd because, of course, firms spend a lot of time trying to figure out how much to pay people when they hire HR departments. And even in some cases, some recent research shows they'll pay other companies that have information on what their competitors are paying.
So if I don't think I'm paid enough, well, a lot of us don't think we're paid enough, and we go and ask the employer to pay us more, that employer in a competitive labor market,
they would correctly say, sorry, I can't pay you more.
And then if I wanted to go and get paid some more in a competitive labor market, I go looking and I wouldn't be able to find it.
Right. Everybody that'd be willing to hire you, they'd offer you the same wage.
Right. So monopsony then, that changes things how?
Well, in the monopsonistic world, employers are going to differ in terms of how much they're willing to pay. The big companies that are more productive are going to offer people higher wages, and the less productive employers are going to end up being smaller because they offer lower wages.
Now, that sounds like the real world to me. Where do we find monopsony?
Well, I think it is extremely prevalent. I think all companies are able to make active price setting decisions, more or less. We might be more worried about it in settings where there are really narrow labor markets, where there's specialized skills and workers don't really have outside options. So the classic example, which was thought for a long time to be a special case, was nurses. The nurse they're basically attached to work at hospitals. And so if they don't like the wage they're paid, there's not much they can do about it. A very nice paper showed a test of this. They showed that when the VA hospitals, that's the Veteran Administration's agency in the US, which is a federal agency, when they changed the pay scales nationally, that in local markets that had VA hospital, that the non-VA hospitals raised their wages to match the VA hospital pay increase. And so it showed that they were doing that to keep up in terms of competition with the VA hospital.
And are we seeing in industries where there is an increased concentration of firms, that's something that economists and regulators worry about at the moment. Do you see those monopsony effects there?
It depends on how you want to measure concentration. So some people are measuring it based upon job ads, and it's not clear that what you see on a particular job portal, monster.com or whatever, that's an accurate measure of what your labor market is. So there's a lot of fighting about what's the right measure of a labor market. But a number of studies by different teams do show that wages seem to be lower in more concentrated markets. Now, I think what economists want to see is evidence of causality. So they don't want to just compare a more concentrated market to a less concentrated market. They'd like to see what actually happens if there's a merger or if there's an entry of a new firm. And there is some evidence on that, and people get different effect sizes, but there does seem to be the case that if there's a merger that wages fall a little bit.
And that's the behavior of firms. What about the behavior of employees? Do we see evidence for monopsony there? Where would you look for it? Because it's not always very easy for people to change jobs for a lot of reasons.
Well, another area that's been controversial in the US is this literature on non-compete clauses. So lots of companies, like fast food chains, had been forcing people to sign these
Fast
non-competes.
food chains are doing it now.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I think less so now because there's been kind of a crackdown on that. But that was something that was happening.
The Federal Trade Commission today issued a proposal banning non-compete clauses that prevent workers from switching employers or starting a new business. About 1 in 5 Americans, approximately 30 million people, are affected by these policies.
A lot of tech companies were forcing people to sign non-compete agreements and so on. But then the state of California decided not to allow those to be enforced. At one point, there was a smoking gun evidence that several large tech companies in Silicon Valley, famously Steve Jobs, had called up some other tech companies and said, we're going to have a no-call list on our engineers. So you're not allowed to target any of my engineers and I won't target any of yours. And that was a form of collusion. Now, it was unusual in that they actually had the email for this.
Yeah.
Normally, we don't see things like that, but that kind of behavior might be going on in other important situations as well.
Yeah, that is about as smoking as a smoking gun gets.
Yes.
Is it perhaps then the case that there's a lot more monopsony around than we thought of in the past?
Views within the profession about how empirically relevant it is have changed a lot. It used to be viewed as fringe viewpoint on how labor markets operate. It sounds even a bit Marxist, right? Because it sounds like it's about power relationships. The employer is exploiting workers. But it does have a rigorous basis to it. And I think that we're seeing more and more evidence that it's not some aberrant state of affairs that only pertains to very unusual labor markets, nurses or coal miners or something like a company town. It's actually a more generic feature of labor markets that people have limited outside options, and employers sometimes are able to exploit that by saying, well, if I pay lower wages, not everyone is going to leave. There's some people that I'm the best option that they're going to have, and there's nothing they can do about it.
You see a lot of activity from regulators investigating abuse of monopoly power. You never hear in the headlines that anyone's being investigated for abuse of monopsony power. Why not?
In the US, actually, now there are investigations for monopsony power. And Lena Khan, who is at the FTC, the Biden administration has just announced new merger guidelines that take into account the potential consequences in the labor market of mergers. So it's not just that there's abstract talk of it. There are guidelines that should be used by regulators now that look at things like concentration and likely impact on workers of a potential merger to decide whether the merger should be approved.
What are the policy remedies that are possible? What do you think works well?
I think our understanding of policy remedies is extremely tentative right now. So I think we've just established that in some cases, a merger can have wage effects. You know, what is the right way to deal with these issues? I think we have far from a complete understanding. I think that obviously in cases where there's a literal collusion, like in the Apple case, there I think it's pretty clear cut. But what are the right policies to use in settings where just the everyday fact that some large firms have a big market share and are able to suppress wages to some extent? It's not clear. One lever is antitrust policy, but another lever is just the usual system of taxes. And firms have to pay taxes through the payroll tax, and they also are subject to regulations like the minimum wage. One classic proposal is to try to target the minimum wage so that firms aren't able to exploit their market power. The difficulty there is you have to be able to set the minimum wage just right to get that right. Because if you set it too high, then the firms will be constrained. They won't be able to hire as many workers as they should employ. If you set it too low, it doesn't do anything. You want to set it just in the sweet spot, and it really presumes a lot of knowledge on the part of regulators. And so there continue to be very extensive debates about that.
As ever with market power, it's quite hard to know what's going on. It's also pretty hard to know how to fix it if there is something going on. But good luck with your research on it, Pat.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. The Rockwell Foundation Berlin Institute for the Economy and the Future of Work is providing new knowledge to inform public debate and to create the best possible basis for policy making. Find out more at rfberlin.com.